Thank you, Stephanie, and I want to send out a warm welcome to everyone from around the world. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Jeff Hull. I'm the Director of Education and Business Development for the Institute of Coaching, and we are very excited to have Stephen Hayes and David Wilson with us today. For those of us that do coaching that has any kind of group dynamic, I know a number of you do team coaching, do facilitation with groups, and of course, coaching even one-on-one is always conducted within a group context. Hopefully this will be very enlightening and interesting to all of you. I'm particularly excited about this topic because I have had a number of opportunities to work with groups, and I'm always looking to hear what is the latest thought leadership and science around group functioning, optimizing group dynamics, and then interspersing coaching practices so that we can not only elevate individual performance, but hopefully get the best out of any group or team. So very excited to have our guest speakers with us. I want to encourage you, as Stephanie mentioned, to send in your questions throughout the webinar. I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, and they will share a PowerPoint presentation and talk with us. But they'll also take breaks during our entire program and have an opportunity to receive questions. So if you send the questions through the question function, I'll do my best to try to get to as many of the questions as possible. If we don't get to all the questions, and unfortunately that does tend to happen with this time-limited webinar format, I will also be happy to stay in touch with people that are interested in getting their questions answered and pass on information to our speakers so that if there's something that's still out there that you'd like to learn about, we can make sure that you get your question to them. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We're fortunate to have two of them who are going to tag team. As Stephanie said, Dr. Stephen Hayes is a foundation professor from University of Nevada, and he is also the chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Nevada. Stephen is an author of over 35 books, so he is a very prolific author and more than 500 scientific articles, interests covering basic research, applied research, methodology, and the philosophy of science. He maintains an active laboratory focused on language pragmatics and semantic relations. He's also known for his methodological work on single-case experimental designs and has written extensively on contextualism as a philosophical system. In 1992, he was listed by the Institute for Scientific Information and the American Psychological Society as the 30th highest impact psychologist in the world during the 1986-1990 period, based on the citation impact of his writings. He's been a keynote speaker at our Harvard Coaching Conference in Leadership and Healthcare as recently as last year. So he's familiar with the Institute and someone that we love to have both doing webinars and also as a keynote in our conferences. We also have David Sloan Wilson with us today. He's the president of the Evolution Institute. He is the SUNY Distinguished Professor at Binghamton University. And according to the bio that he shared with us, he likes to consider himself an evolutionist who studies all aspects of humanity in addition to the biological world. So he manages a number of programs designed to expand the influence of evolutionary theory in higher education, public policy, community-based research, and religion. He is also responsible for a number of books, including Evolution for Everyone, How Darwin's Theory Can Change the Way We Think About Our Lives, and The Neighborhood Project, Using Evolution to Improve My City One Block at a Time. So we're very excited to have both of our distinguished speakers with us, and without further ado, I want to turn it over to Stephen.
Well, thanks for that introduction, and I'm happy to be with you again. I was there last year at the conference and met the leadership of the Institute, and I've worked with coaches. We have a special interest group on coaching and the society that does the kind of work that I do, and have worked with professionally in a variety of ways. So I'm excited also just about being able to do something of service to you and the work that you do, and to be here with my colleague David, who has done such wonderful work in bringing together evolutionary perspectives and the behavioral science perspectives that are probably more familiar to you in your role as a coach. The purpose that we have for our hour and a little bit is to explain the PROSOCIAL project that we've been working together on with a whole team of colleagues, and it's linked to acceptance and commitment therapy, or to, and even more importantly, to Lynn Ostrom's design principles. There's a more generic kind of purpose, which is to just explain how you might link evolutionary ideas to your work as coaches. And we have a very specific purpose of wanting to invite you to explore this combination of approaches, this exciting new technology we're calling PROSOCIAL, to improve the functioning of groups. And you'll be able to do that through a free website that just went live about a week or so ago, and we'll, at the end of our talk here, explain how to get to it and how to use it in any work that you're doing. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, also do basic research on language and cognition, as Jeff was describing. And initially, most of my work was in the area of psychotherapy. But increasingly, it's clear that individuals function as part of larger groups. And even when you're working with a single person in a role as a coach, you're also working with their team, their family, their organization indirectly or sometimes directly. And so as I've been exposed to David's ideas, and especially these ideas of multi-level selection and the centrality of groups, it's fundamentally changed how I think about the one-on-one work that we do. And so we have a real collaboration here between different perspectives, but also different levels of analysis. David, do you want to just introduce yourself to the group and say a bit about our collaboration before I dive into the content?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm also very happy to be here, and the collaboration between Steve and myself, I think, is very, very exciting. The applied behavioral sciences and with evolutionary science, also from the individual level of analysis to the group level of analysis, all in a way that's both theoretically rich and highly practical. So this is exciting times for us, and hopefully we can share some of that excitement here.
We really view, both of us, and I think you may share this, many of you, that the reunification of biological and behavioral science is really the destiny of both fields moving forward. But we need to do that in a way that empowers the role of each participant in that, and in particular in the behavioral sciences, because as the softer of the two, it tends to get overwhelmed sometimes by biological perspectives. And we think we can do that inside the umbrella and the consilience that's provided by evolutionary theory if we can go beyond a purely gene-centric account. And so we're going to start just by going through a few of the arguments about why you need to think about evolution in a much broader way than you may have been used to up to this point. Ironically, some of the biggest spurs of rethinking evolutionary ideas has come from advances in that field itself, especially from the Human Genome Project, which really has shown that the idea that there are genes that code directly for phenotypic traits is by and large false. An example from the GIANT project, the genetic investigation of anthropometric traits, which has looked at 250,000 subjects with full genomic mapping and looking at things like body mass index and height. And you find that here height, this very simple kind of feature of our phenotype, is sensitive to over 400 gene regions, almost 600 specific genetic variants have been identified, and if you combine all of those, you can account for about 20% of the variants. I saw another study recently from the GIANT project where 79 variants involved in body mass index, and it accounts for about 3% of the variants. So when we have the detailed level of knowledge about the genes that we now have, some of the old ideas that we're going to see some sort of point-to-point correspondence between specific genes and important phenotypic traits are being undermined. At the very same time that we've learned that genes are not the only biological inheritance stream. We've known that for some time, but the importance now of epigenetic processes, of things that are heritable to a degree, but that regulate primarily gene expression, so things like methylation or small interfering RNA, DNA loops, histone acetylation, histone bundling, and so forth, have a big impact on whether particular genes are able to be transcribed and turned into proteins, and some of those are directly heritable, even in human beings. So just a few examples. In plants with seeds that don't greatly disperse, we know that plants that are grown in the same light environment, seeds that are grown in the same light environment as their maternal plants, have 3.4 times greater fitness than siblings that are moved to a new light environment. In other words, a mama plant prepares the seeds for what they're likely to see in the environment, and it does that by up and down regulating the genes in the plant itself. The behaviors that we engage in change our underlying biology, and some of that can be passed on. In a mouse model, mice that are licked by their mothers are more likely to lick their offspring, and we now know that some of that is due to methylation of DNA, that is, to epigenetic processes that make this behavior more likely. This goes all the way down to classical conditioning, and really, you could say it this way, Lamarck is back. How far it'll come back, we'll see, but this is a new study that was published in Nature Neuroscience. If it's replicated, I think this is really a Nobel-level study because it's so important. But in a mouse model, classical conditioning, smell, shock, smell, shock, smell, shock, then you take the pups, you rear them apart, you even cross-foster them with other mothers, and then you look at their pups, so we're now 2 generations out, you expose the mice to the smell and they startle. And we know something about how that happens. It happens due to the epigenetic changes of a gene that's involved in smell as a sensory system. So some of the things that we're learning are being passed on to our children and our children's children. And so you really need to think about evolution in a way that includes the evolution of behavioral systems within the lifetime of an individual that then interface with these other systems. David is really the expert in multi-level selection, and the basic point here is an old one, Darwin talked about it, but that between group competition can advantage entire groups. So for example, if we work together cooperatively within groups, and as a result the individuals do better and the groups do well, there's an evolutionary advantage, a selective pressure at this higher level of organization. It turns out that's actually quite common. You can see it in many animal situations. The reason why I teach evolution and behavior, and it's hard to find a book that will actually focus on this with great intensity, is they say, yes, that's true, but then selfishness at the individual level will undermine those processes. But in fact, that's not always true, because sometimes there are adequate dampers that are put on individual selfish adaptations. And if you have that combination, then you really, which is not common, you can see major evolutionary transitions. You have 37 trillion cells in your body, and these nucleated cells have another life form inside of them. Mitochondria, separate DNA passed only by the maternal line, been that way for billions of years. It's a cooperative system. But even today, mitochondria will fool plants into producing only by the female line, because that's the way that DNA is passed in mitochondria, and it produces male cytoplasmic sterility. So billions of years later, there's still some selfishness in the partnering between mitochondria and our nucleated cells that is dampened down by systems that we have to detect that. That's true with us as multi-level, multicellular organisms as well, also billions of years old. And we know that individual cells will sometimes, if you were to put it into a kind of a purposive language decide that they want more of themselves than just serving the interests of the group. We have a name for that. It's called cancer. And your body is constantly detecting early signs of cancer or precancerous cells and sending out signals that will allow your body to respond to that and to kill those rebel cells. And at a higher level of organization, we're used to thinking of bees and termites and others as them organisms at the level of the hive, that you really can't understand their behavior unless you track their entire group. And the argument is, and there's a major scientific movement on this, is that humans to a degree can be considered more like termites and bees. I mean, the joke is we're 10% chimp and 90% bee. We are such a cooperative species, by far the most cooperative primate. We overlapped with other primates and even interbred with them, but we kind of won out in part, the argument goes, due to our level of cooperation. And you can see that in very, very young children, even before language. Language builds that out in many ways. And so, for example, our ability to point and have an infant look, the only other organisms that are really good at that are dogs, and they've been hanging out with us for a long time. We naturally work together to pick things up, carry. We're even biologically set up so that's easy to do. We have whites around our eyes. You can see where your mother is looking. Much harder for a gorilla baby to do that. They have to see where mama's head is turned. So these are just all reasons to think that a new era has come in evolutionary thinking, and you have to think much more broadly, not just about genes leading to behavior, but also behavior modifying the cellular processes that regulate genes occurring at multiple levels, all simultaneously in gigantic systems. So we need 6 concepts to be able to start thinking about evolution that way and to be able to apply it to our work as psychotherapists or as coaches. One is you need to have variation. If there's no variation, there's no selection. And if you're doing your coaching work with somebody who has a very rigid pattern of behavior, the old joke, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got, will apply. No variation, no progress. But we also have to have selection. It isn't the life and death selection that we see in genetic evolution when we're working with people, but we can look at the selection of particular practices or behaviors based on what they want to manifest in their own life. And then we need processes of retention. You have to retain the good variants, and often behaviorally we're talking about how to do that through habit formation. If we're going to evolve on purpose, we have to keep our eyes focused on context, because not every variation is likely to be successful, and we only have so much time. So blind evolutionary processes are how we came to this point, but now we have to learn how to mount those processes intentionally, and that means how to look at context and decide whether something is a productive idea. You don't want to put a phone booth in the middle of a field. It's not going to be used. And in the same way, you don't want to put particular behavioral variants in all environments. It has to fit the particular environment. We have to think about this in a nested way. And so even if you're working with an individual, you have to think about the nestedness of the selection processes that are involved with small groups and then larger organizations. But even within them, you have to think about, well, what are the various kinds of things within a single organism? That could be different aspects of the person's repertoire. It could be different parts of them as physical beings that you need to be concerned about the person's sleep and their dietary practices, even if you're working, let's say, on their leadership skills. And so this concept of levels and being able to think about the whole and the nestedness of everything we do is critical. And then which of the particular dimensions you're going to focus on, because it's all a system. There's many dimensions we can focus on in a particular situation. It might be important to focus, let's say, on emotional flexibility, in another one, let's say, on behavioral skills, in another one, let's say, on health practices, diet, exercise, and so on, and another on how your organization is put together. So these are the 6 concepts that we need to keep track of when we think of things in an evolutionary point of view. Now, ACT is part of the PROSOCIAL project. It's on the front end of it. And I gave a talk on ACT. This is a little more than probably is needed, these slides that I have here on the PROSOCIAL project itself. But I want to briefly describe it and then see how you can link what's at the beginning of the PROSOCIAL project, which comes out of ACT, to the Ostrom principles that David will talk about. What are the biggest enemies of variation? There are 2. One is avoidance. If you're working with somebody and they're emotionally avoidant, if they're avoidant of behavior change, if they avoid situations where they need to learn how to do new things, this is one of the most rigidity producing processes because you're no longer in contact with the stimulus situations, the environmental circumstances, the social situations in which you can learn how to do new things. Another is the overextension of our verbal abilities. These more recent additions in terms of dimensions, our symbolic thinking processes are somewhere between 200,000 and 2.5 million years old, very likely. We know that because some of the very simple things that infants do that are critical to language development, the other primates do not do. But this new process of thinking symbolically can overwhelm us. We can disappear into our heads. We can follow rules. And we know that even at the neurobiological level, when you follow a rule, even if the outcome of doing so is negative, it will light up the reward centers of the brain as if you did something that was positive. So we have these more recent evolutionary adaptations harnessing these more primitive and more earlier adaptations in such a way that people can be more interested in doing what they think is right than in doing what works. In ACT, or the whole range of acceptance, mindfulness, and values-based procedures that are now common, ACT is 30 years old, was there early, but there's a whole list of them, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, DBT, metacognitive therapy, and on and on. But all of them have methods to help put your logical, problem-solving mode of mind on a leash, to restrain that excessive domination by this rule-generating part of us, and to begin to watch your thoughts and make some choices as to whether or not they're likely to be helpful to be followed. Sometimes it's a good guide and sometimes not, but the person has to decide, not just your automatic verbal and cognitive processes, that you need to do things to actually produce emotional flexibility, cognitive flexibility, behavioral flexibility. And in an ACT model, this is our usual way we present it, is in this hexagon form. These 2 processes of emotional acceptance, meaning of curiosity and exploration, not tolerance, and what we call diffusion, which is a neologism, meaning to look at your thoughts rather than simply from them, are repertoire expansion processes. But if you're going to evolve on purpose, you have to consciously contact the moment outside and inside, and so you need centering processes to bring greater consciousness into the present moment, both within and without, so that your particular changes fit your own history and fit what is afforded by the environment that you're in. You're going to need, if you're going to evolve on purpose, you need to pick your selection criteria. What are they? Some of them may be picked for you. You can't say, well, I think I'll only sleep 3 hours a night. Good luck if you do that. But other things very much are up to you, and people can get into an automatic mode of mind where they forget that. In PROSOCIAL, we spend a fair amount of time really looking at the values of the individuals and the values of the groups so that we can focus on what would move the group forward and the individuals in the group forward according to the selection criteria that they would choose if it was a choice, and it is, and then to groove those habits at the individual level and the group level by practice. If new behaviors don't become habitual, they're susceptible to falling away and to going back to old habits and patterns. And so these are these processes of active values-based engagement. All of those together we call psychological flexibility, and we've brought these ideas into the work that we've done on the Ostrom principles. And so I think at this point I'll turn the mic over. Or maybe we could take a few questions if there are any, since I promised I'd pause at about 20 minutes, and I'm right about
Right,
there.
yep, that's good. This is our interlude now for questions.
So if there's questions just about the evolutionary principles or ACT or what
I think it would be great. Stephen, I think it would be great if you could back up real quick, because I'm sensing that there are going to be a number of folks, if you think about the audience of coaches that don't have a background in genetics and maybe and in the science of epigenetics. So maybe if you could back up, I know on one of your earlier slides you went very quickly through 2 or 3 different examples.
Yes.
And maybe just to clarify what you meant by some of those terms.
Okay.
It goes back to fairly early in your presentation, but a couple of people were saying, what is methylation?
Methylation.
Well, a couple of clarifications would be great.
David is more the expert here, but if I could do 30 seconds, I'll pass it over. In Biology 101, we all learned about how DNA is then read by RNA, which then, gives the command instructions as to how to produce proteins, which is how cells differentiate and how we build our bodies and minds and so forth. And it turns out that you can, for example, hang a little methyl group on cytosine, and then any gene that contains it is very hard to read by RNA. So it'd be like taking a gene that you didn't want to have read and sort of taking your glasses and rubbing sandpaper on it. The biological processes that transcribe that information can no longer do so efficiently. And so there's a whole set of them, and they're coming out of the labs at a rapid rate that alter how particular genes are expressed, and it turns out that is itself controlled by genes and also by your experience. So can I give you just one example? If you meditate for 8 weeks, there's a recent study out of Harvard, actually, where you've got about 25,000 genes. If you meditate for 8 weeks, 1,500 genes are turned on or off reliably, and they're mostly genes that are involved in stress responses. So every cell in your body is now about 8% or so different, 7% if I'm doing the math right, as a result of just a half an hour a day for 8 weeks. And so we're modifying our genes even as we speak. And learning how that works puts the behavioral sciences much more central now to try to understanding how evolution works. And maybe I'll turn it over to David for that better answer to that question.
No, Steve did a great job. We don't need to know the mechanistic details. So functionally, what happens is that there's this dielectric process where the environment is turning genes on and off, and so the influence of the environment of the genes is a two-way street. And moreover, some of this is transgenerational, so some of that environmental stuff doesn't stop with the generations. Your offspring and even your grand offspring can inherit some of these patterns of gene expressions. So we can call it Lamarckian if we want, but it's the case that what you experience can be transmitted to future generations. But then, of course, we get beyond the epigenetics, which is still biology-y, and we get to forms of social learning and especially forms of symbolic thought. We know we inherit our cultures. That's a no-brainer, but to actually think of it seriously from an evolutionary perspective, culture as an inheritance system, our symbolic meaning systems is like a genotype that has everyone has a phenotype. So Steve and I talk about a symbotype phenotype relationship, similar to a genotype-phenotype relationship. These themselves are metaphorical transfers, but they're very powerful in causing us to think in new ways.
I think maybe the bottom line would be you need to think of the individuals you're working with as evolving systems. And you're working not just with them, but you're working with larger groups. And we know that if there's a change in an individual, you will see a reliable change in the person's friends, the friends of their friends, and the friends of the friends of their friends. So if a person reads a book, stops smoking, sees a movie, you pick it, you're influencing perhaps tens of thousands of people. And so these kinds of cultural processes are harnessing biological processes. They're an evolutionary system in itself. These behavioral changes that we're making with individuals when we work in our coaching role are things that will go across time and people. And thinking about it that way gives us new ways of encouraging and supporting, motivating, and producing more permanent behavior change, which is what PROSOCIAL is about.
And Stephen, if I understood you correctly, and some people are asking, the 6 dimensions that you mentioned are all based on individual response, right? So avoidance, all of those concepts that you went through, they're not.
No, there are parallel processes at the group level, and you can find entire cultures that are avoidant, and certainly organizations that are avoidant.
I was wondering about
that. Part of what the Ostrom principles do is they allow you to take those 6 principles that are principles about the evolution of systems at whatever level we're speaking about, and that includes the individual, what we're used to calling the individual, but it also includes couples and groups, small groups, and entire cultures. And that's exactly what's exciting about bringing these 2 fields together, as you see this rich interplay at these different levels of analysis. So no, these principles apply at all levels of organization.
And then I would imagine that's what you're about to head into, right?
Exactly.
Group
I
side.
think so, yes.
Great.
Okay, so shall we proceed then?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Steve. And I need to cue Steve to advance the slides for me, so that's a little awkward, but we'll still do it. Happy to introduce Elinor Ostrom. She's a political scientist by training and won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. What she studied were groups that manage common pool resources around the world, often traditional groups. These are groups that manage such things as forests, fields, fisheries, irrigation systems. All of them are subject to the so-called tragedy of the commons, tragedy of overuse. And the received economic wisdom was that the tragedy will always occur unless you can privatize the resource, if possible, or regulate it from above. And what Elinor showed was that contrary to conventional wisdom, back, Steve, not quite. Can you bring me back a little bit? There we go. That these groups are actually capable of managing their own affairs, but only if they possess certain core design principles. And now, Steve, we could advance. And I was very lucky to work with Lynn for several years before her death. And what we did was generalize the core design principles that appeared in an article in this journal, and that will be available to the audience then when they want to check back on this. And next slide, Steve. And a related article that discusses this is my article with Steve and our colleagues Tony Bigland and Dennis Embry called Evolving the Future Toward a Science of Intentional Change. These articles and other articles basically form the academic foundation, the scientific foundation for the practical framework that we are discussing today. So what's at issue here is how do we make groups work? This is what's general. All groups whose members are trying to work together to achieve common goals are faced with a common set of problems. They have to coordinate appropriate action for the task at hand. They have to suppress disruptive, self-serving behaviors within the group. That's one great enemy of groups working well, is self-serving behaviors within the group. And they must avoid interference and cultivate appropriate relations with other groups. And this is true for all social species, not just humans. I'm lucky to be trained as an evolutionary biologist, so I've studied the birds and the bees in addition to humans. And so this is true for all social groups. And so without further ado, here they are. These are the 8 core design principles that make groups work well. Please think about your own groups as I go through them. The well-working group has a strong group identity and understanding of purpose. They know they're a group and they know who's in the group and what the group is about. 2, there's proportional equivalence of costs and benefits. It's unsustainable for some group members to do all the work while others get the benefits. It need not be even Steven, but if someone works harder, they should really get proportional gains. And those are psychological gains in addition to material gains. Praise and such things as that are often as important or more important than material gains. Number 3, decision-making must be by consensus or some other process recognized as fair. If decision-making is unfair, then that provides an opening for self-serving disruptive behaviors. 4, agreed upon behaviors must be monitored. If you can't tell what people are doing, then that's an opening for disruptive behaviors. 5, if people misbehave, then there has to be something to be done about it. Need not start out harsh, can be friendly. That's friendly reminders are enough to keep most people in solid citizen mode, but not always. And so it must be necessary to escalate. So that's what graduated sanctions are. 6, conflicts will occur in most groups, and they need to be resolved quickly and in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. 7, in order to do the first 6, there must be a local autonomy. The group must have elbow room to govern its own affairs. And if that's not possible, if it's being bossed from the outside, then all bets are off. And 8, in a multi-group environment, and all environments nowadays are multi-group environments, then there has to be appropriate relations among groups that more or less reflect the same principles as the relationships among individuals within groups. And that is a very important point. That's part of what multi-level selection is that this is scale independent, that if you have a group composed of members, then they need to be organized a certain way. And as we frame shift upward, then that group is in an ecosystem of other groups, then that meta group basically has to be organized according to the same design principles. And that can hold for multiple tiers basically, all the way up to nations within the global village and all the way down to genes within a multicellular organism. Now we can kind of group these 8 design principles into 3 categories. One has to do with coordination. Every group has to coordinate their action for the task at hand. Then there's the suppression of disruptive self-serving behaviors. And then there's the avoidance of interference and to cultivate appropriate relations with other groups. Now, a few observations about these core design principles. Number 1, they're so intuitive. I don't think that they surprised anyone in this audience. Number 2, some groups adopt them without requiring coaching, and some coaching methods have converged upon them. It's very important to stress that what Lynn Ostrom did was she showed that groups vary in their employment of the design principles. Some did them well without needing to be told, but they were sadly lacking in others. So even though these might seem obvious, it is not the case that all groups spontaneously adopt them, and so therefore there's work to do in order to improve the efficacy of at least some groups. Okay, Steve, next one. So, why is it if these design principles are so simple and straightforward, why don't more groups employ them? There's good reasons. One is conflicts of interest within the group. Some people are bent on getting their way. They have their own interests in mind more than their group's interest. Also, sometimes they think they have their group's interest in mind, but they're also domineering, and so they want to stage manage the process, and that becomes part of the problem. Then even if your own group works well, then it's out of the frying pan and into the fire with respect to the multi-group environment. So now number 3 is a little more subtle, and it has to do with the fact, and I think this gets us a little bit back into ACT, that we are such a cultural species that what makes sense to us is so much dependent upon our theories and worldviews and all of their forms. And so there's competing narratives, and especially the narrative of Homo economicus, basically the selfish individual. Everything can be explained in terms of the selfish individual, and selfishness is actually good for the group. This is a narrative which actually causes the design principles to disappear and no longer become obvious. So it's very important to have the right narrative, a narrative that's scientifically correct. I like this metaphor that the design principles are like the organs of your body. You need all of your organs, and removing one results in death. The design principles aren't quite that essential, but I think it is interesting that you could have a group that does really well on 7 out of 8 and still be crippled by the lack of that one. Also, a profound insight of Lynn Ostrom is that although these design principles are general, they're functional design principles, and how you implement them is not general. She found empirically that take any one of them, monitoring, for example, even groups that have to do the same thing, such as manage irrigation systems, she found that they implemented the design principles in different ways that worked for their situation. So the implementation is highly localized and contextual. That prevents this from being a cookie cutter approach. We can provide a functional blueprint, but how it gets implemented is something which requires the group to figure that out. Okay, next. Now, so the next question is, how general are these core design principles? Lynn established them for one kind of group, and then we generalized them theoretically. And for years now, I and others have been working to show that these core design principles are general. Name a group, and they tend to need these design principles. And here's just a little tour of some of the groups we've been working with. One is neighborhoods. And so in my city of Binghamton, we have, we could go to the next slide, Steve. We have Design Your Own Park project, which uses the opportunity to turn a neglected space into a neighborhood park that becomes a common pool resource and empowers the group in many respects. And then another gentleman who was a student of Lynn Ostrom, next slide, Steve, did the same thing in Buffalo, or at least actually observed the same thing in a Buffalo neighborhood. This is Roy Okerson, a neighborhood in Buffalo, which got transformed by these design principles. In the next 3 slides, you could go through them quickly, Steve. Just shows it's such a wonderful story. This is a cooperative business. It's a nursery in the neighborhood. Provides an income for the neighbors. The neighbors are taking great care of their houses. It's just inspirational to go through this neighborhood and show how it bloomed, basically, by applying these design principles. We work in schools. That's the next slide. And I have this slide here. Let's pause on this for just a second. So there are the 8 design principles. Just consult your own experience and ask yourself the question, how well did your school experience environment conform to these design principles? You know, they could have. Some people have a great experience in school, and I wager that if you did, then it's thanks to the fact that of these design principles. So, but for many students, including many at-risk students, then the school environment is sadly lacking in these design principles. And we had an opportunity to do a really good randomized control design to design a school according to these design principles in Binghamton. And as with the neighborhood, the results were transformative. In the first year, the students that had failed 3 or more of their classes the previous year just popped up like corks when you gave them a pro-social environment. And next slide, Steve.
Hey, David. David,
yeah?
Could I interrupt you just for 1 second? I think there's a question that I think is, especially as you're going through these examples, might be particularly relevant for all of us, which is...
Sure. I mean, I don't mean to go too fast. I did want to leave time for questions, so that's what we have now. Sure.
That's okay. If you don't mind being interrupted, it's just, I'm curious, and a couple people have indicated a question about the priority of these 8 principles. So are they all equal, or is there a hierarchy? Are there like, when you're looking at these school systems or the neighborhood situations, I mean, are there particular dimensions that are more impactful than others, or is it all equal?
Well, I've given the organ metaphor that they are all necessary. But that said, I'd like to make 2 points. DP1 might be the most important in the sense that if you don't have a strong sense of group identity and purpose, and don't even know who's in your group, then all bets are off. So that's one point. And then another point is that sometimes a given design principle isn't needed at any particular moment. And often with small groups, there's such unity of purpose, and the group is so small that monitoring is not necessary, conflict is unlikely to arise. So the design principles need not be needed at all points. And with small groups, they kind of are much easier to implement, so much so that you don't even know they're there. In a very small group, monitoring comes for free, for example. So I think there are differences. And when I get to the PROSOCIAL, you'll see that we actually ask the group members about that. We ask them how important is this design principle for your group? Are you aware of this design principle? How well are you implementing it? And how much are you handicapped if you're not implementing it? We ask all those questions. And so we'll actually get the data. We'll answer the question in the best possible way by collecting the data.
And is there, you mentioned it, the size of the group, so does it, like, is there a optimal group size? I think as in the coaching world, we're often given the adage that 8 is an optimal number, that a group up to 15 can be corralled and coached fairly effectively, but anything beyond that gets difficult. That a group of 3 is particularly challenging. Any comments on these principles as opposed to a group, as they reflect on group size?
Yeah, totally. I mean, group size is a huge variable, but it depends on the task. And I'm quite familiar with the group decision-making literature. The optimal group size for making a decision varies with the decision-making environment. Sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's a few, and sometimes it actually needs to be a council. So there's no single answer to that question. And but I think if there is a single answer, is that for the most part, smaller is better. But nevertheless, groups do often need to be big. Often, think of a business that grows. You don't want to stop a business from growing, but as it grows, then the dynamics change. And when it gets beyond that 8, 10, 15, so on, if it gets beyond 100, there's a number called Dunbar's number, which after Robin Dunbar, who's a colleague of mine, and Dunbar's number has become kind of famous, that above 150 or so, then the human mind just loses its ability to keep track of individuals and histories of relationships and things like that. So there's a fundamental change that occurs there. But long before then, you're absolutely right. I think 8 is probably a pretty good number. And once again, we'll be able to test that because with PROSOCIAL, as I'll quickly get to, we will be collecting data on groups, and group size will be a variable.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So this basically shows that for the state-mandated exams in New York, the Regents Academy students, which is the first bar, did much better than the comparison group, which is the third bar, and much to our delight, they even did as well as the average high school student during the first year of the program. So this is powerful evidence that the design principles can work across multiple social environments. This is a great development in the business world called B Corps. They've been certified by B Lab, and B Lab basically a corporation that wants to be known as socially accountable submits information to B Lab, who gives them a score, and if that score is high enough, then they can advertise themselves as a B Corp. And we've been studying B Corps for the design principles at 2 levels. Again, the internal organization of the group and how they conduct themselves in a larger ecosystem of groups. And the bottom line is that these groups do very well as businesses, in part because they do function so well as groups and have created cooperative social environments with other groups. So the design principles have a lot of application in the business world. And then also we have a project with intentional communities. These are communities that are trying to live according to certain principles. Often they're eco-villages. We tend to dismiss them as hippie communes, but they are a very interesting bunch of groups, well worth our attention. And we're also studying them from a design principles approach. Okay, so next, and also scale independence. If you go up, wonderful books on national scale variation. The Spirit level and other books show that on the x-axis we have an index of income inequality. On the y-axis, quality of life, strong relationships. I'm actually speaking from Norway, which is anchoring the good end of the distribution. Sucks for you guys to be in America. That's the anchoring the other end of the distribution. Go back, Steve, to the previous one. There's the USA anchoring the worldwide extreme of inequality among developed nations. You can take the USA and you can unpack it to the 50 states, and that's the next slide. Danged if the thing doesn't replicate itself at the state level, that there's a strong relationship between equality and quality of life. So these design principles hold for everything from genes within a multicellular organism to nations in the global village. We want to know about this. So now next slide. Okay, so here's our interim summary. This provides a blueprint for the efficacy of groups. We have a strong theoretical foundation, accumulating empirical support. We think it's relevant to nearly any group whose members must work together to achieve common goals. And so next. So the next challenge is to make this approach available to as many groups as possible worldwide, and to create a scientific database so that we can continue to study these groups from a scientific perspective. And so that's what Steve and I, with a really awesome development team, have been doing over the last few years. We call it PROSOCIAL. There's our logo. It's the spokes of the wheel. That's 8 spokes for the 8 design principles. And it's done in the form of an internet platform, and we want to create a network of facilitators. So this is why we're speaking to a perfect group of coaches, basically. We definitely want to involve you in this project. It's the institutional collaboration is between the Evolution Institute and also New Harbinger Press, which publishes a lot of the books of Steve and the contextual behavioral science tradition. And I have to give a call out to New Harbinger, because they have done just so much to create this internet platform, which is a very ambitious platform. This is the URL. Actually, the one at the beginning is misspelled, so this is the right one, prosocialgroups.org. And if you visit it, you get to this page basically, and in which you can learn about the what this is basically. Next slide, Steve. There's a nice introductory video, 6-minute video that talks about it, in addition to lots of text material, so you could learn quite a bit coming in. And the next slide, Steve. Okay, so one thing this does, it gives each group its own homepage. If you know about things like meetup.com, meetup.com, or if you use things like Blackboard or Basecamp, there's a lot of internet sites and applications which basically provide basic tools for a group to work with, to email each other, to have discussion forums, to post documents, and do that sort of thing. So we provide this to our groups. It's not different than the others, but it's a very useful tool, and it's free of charge, which the others typically aren't. What's really special about PROSOCIAL is the course that you take, and which takes you through the design principles. So and they do it as a group. So either all members of a group or a subgroup, and that number 8 probably close to the optimal number to do this. They register onto the website, they get their home page, and then they step through this course. And the course begins by just taking basic information, demographics, and then survey information, basically. Let's see if that's in the next slide. Steve, is that? Right. So, and so we worked hard to make this a process that a group can take subject to the constraints of their busy lives. It's so hard for groups to get together often they can't get together. They have to be a virtual group just because their members are so separated in space. And so what this does is there's a number of steps. Each step is taken within a window of time that's decided by the group. So the group says, we'll give ourselves 3 days to take the next step. And what that means is that every member of the group needs to log in during 3 days and take the steps. Typically, it's just like, half an hour or something like that. Even busy people can do that. And so we find that this is a really good way for the group to act in a coordinated fashion, even if they find it difficult to get together. Although I hasten to add, as you all know, face-to-face meetings are very important. So we're not counseling that you don't meet face-to-face, but we are making it easy to capture this information without having to meet face-to-face. So the data capture is awesome. As Steve said, this begins with an ACT exercise that I'll describe in a little more detail. Then there's a section in which the group learns about the design principles and assesses themselves. They end by forming short-term measurable goals so that they actually leave the process knowing what to do, and also assigning duties. So this also distributes the work fairly, contributing to design principle number 2. And then they're supposed to stick with it and repeat annually so that this becomes a longitudinal database. Okay, next, I'm close to the end here. So Steve's already told you about ACT. What's really interesting is that what works for an individual also works for a group. And so most groups have an explicit purpose. Often it's like to build a park or to do well in school. But behind those, the explicit purpose is a more general set of values and goals that's helpful to reflect upon. That's one part about ACT. What are your real values? And moving in a valued direction is not always easy for groups in addition to individuals. And so reflecting upon that as a group provides the same benefits, we think, as for an individual. And we use a particular version of ACT that was developed by Kevin Polk, a member of our development team, called the Matrix. That's next. And the Matrix consists of these 4 quadrants. Bottom is mental, top is action, right is towards valued goals, away is away from valued goals. And by reflecting on each of the 4 quadrants, beginning with the lower right quadrant, the positive goals, mental goals, and then moving clockwise so that you end up, what are the obstacles, mental obstacles that get in the way, how do they manifest themselves as action, and then what can we do to move towards our valued goals, ending by thinking of yourself in the center and the crosshairs there so that you can interpret the world around you, both what you're doing and the way you're thinking in terms of this graph. This is, I think, proving to be one of the fastest ways to achieve the objectives of acceptance and commitment therapy. And we have the group, there's a little exercise to introduce the group members. They spin through it as an individual, which is probably helpful in its own right. Most important, they spin through it as a group in the form of discussion forums, basically. And in 4 discussion forums, there's a reflection. And then this is, I think, this is actually Steve's slide. So Steve, you might want to elaborate on it. But basically, this helps the group to know what to monitor. So there's a design principle number 3, how to assign goals and to graduate sanctions. So without actually explicitly telling them about the design principles yet, we're actually building the design principles, certainly group identity and purpose, and also some of the other design principles are being reinforced through the this ACT exercise. Steve, do you want to add to this?
Well,
and
just
also
as an example, because it might be relevant to the coaches in the sense of how you move from individuals to groups. So we do 2 swings through on the matrix. People think about their individual heroes and the values that reflects, but then also what are the things that happen within them that move them away from moving towards those values. And in that process, as you then say, well, what does that look like on the outside? You might say things like, well, if I feel as though I'm not heard, I just start missing meetings, I'm quiet all the time, etc. That helps others know, how to read people in the groups. And so then when we go through the organizational level, the group level, what are our group values? What gets in the way of moving there? What does that look like on the outside? Some of the other Ostrom principles can be fed by the group identity process that comes from sharing values, but also by people being more open about what will it look like if we're not stepping up, so that we can monitor those things by letting other people know, what it looks like when you're not following through. That sort of gives them a way of reading the tea leaves and catching things early before groups really go awry.
Good, that's great. So I have only a couple left, and then we'll have our questions, I think. So, so then I've already covered this basically. The next steps of the online course, both teach and get the group to assess the design principles. And also, the core design principles are necessary but not sufficient. So of course there'll be more design principles. We call them auxiliary, that are needed for a particular group. And so we prompt the group to reflect upon additional design principles. In that school, for example, we had 2 additional design principles for a total of 10. Here's a way to visualize what ends up, that we like to portray it in the form of a wheel, and that irregular polygon there is some imaginary data basically as to what an actual group might look like. And that enables us to say, if you all did well on all design principles, your group would be rolling along pretty smoothly, but your wheel is that thing in the middle. And so that's a way to encourage the group to what to concentrate on, basically. And that's back to what the group is, the most important design principles for that group. And then finally, very common in the business world, so I'm sure some of your coaches know about this, make this distinction between long-term goals, the mission statement, true north, and then what we need to do in order to head towards those goals, and to make those as concrete as possible, measurable, assign responsibilities, and so on. And so we end up with that. So basically, the group is ready to go, and I am very confident, all things considered, that a group that goes through this process is going to come out the other end a much stronger group. This is a awesome data capture. We have all this data. In addition to the stuff that that's obvious, we take the survey information before and after the course, and so right away we're going to measure of short-term change. The matrix entries provides data. We have participation data, not just subjective report basically, but the real behavior, because the behavior is taking place online. Such things as, how many people do their step on time, things like that. Checks for discourse analysis, how much conflict is revealed in the discussion. So this is an amazing, if this is widely used, we will have an amazing scientific database for improving our understanding of the efficacy of groups. Okay, now next. We also want to facilitate communication among groups, and there's 2 kinds. One is groups with shared interests, so school groups, for example, will be able to find each other and directly share best practices. But also a very interesting concept is that if an organization consists of multiple subgroups, then a PROSOCIAL homepage can be assigned to each subgroup, and then the groups can interact with each other. And you could actually emulate the organizational structure, the structure of the organization, through a cluster of PROSOCIAL groups. And that's a way of building what's called polycentric governance, basically, the organization of multiple groups, which is, for me, a very exciting prospect. Okay, I think I've got one more. Now here, of course, use in coaching. PROSOCIAL requires a designated leader within the group, but does not require a coach. Nevertheless, a coach will often, I think very often, be helpful. And so professionals who are already in the business of coaching, we encourage them to incorporate PROSOCIAL into their practice free of charge. Some members of our development team are professional group coaches, basically, so they definitely intend to do that. And also to develop a framework for training the trainers. So this is a perfect moment to be talking about PROSOCIAL to this particular society. And so if you'd like to use ProSocial in your own coaching practices, Paul Atkins is a member of our development team who also coaches groups, and so he's the one who's going to be beginning to create a framework for training the trainers, and so there's his email address. I think that's the end. Let's see.
It is.
Okay, so lovely to present ProSocial, and we have at least a little bit of time for questions.
Great. So clap, clap, clap. if you can hear the audience clapping in the background, that's a thank you for this incredible information. And I have a whole bunch of questions, and I'm sensitive to the fact that we only have about 8 more minutes. So here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to throw out 3 questions at once, and maybe you guys can decide between you back and forth who wants to handle what. But maybe if I combine a couple of questions together, we'll be able to get to more of them. So does that sound okay?
Sure.
Okay. So 3 themes that popped up in the feedback and questions. Number 1, what about virtual groups? So these days, many of us are dealing with organizations that are spread out and not all co-located in one place, and also cross-cultural, cross-regional. So question about these principles and how they function or how they interact with a virtual team or a virtual group is number 1. Number 2, what about the leadership of the group? Jennifer Spalding has a question here, a really good question about leadership selection. And how the group, does it matter how the leader is selected, who the leader is? Is the leader selected by the group or by top-down processes? And what is the impact of leadership selection? And then number 3, a couple of people would love if there's an example of how ProSocial is being used in a corporate or business organizational group as opposed to just a school or a town or something like that, because of course a lot of our coaches are doing leadership work in companies, and they're interested in hearing whether or not you have any examples of this being applied by coaches or by group leaders in business environments. So those are the 3 that I'd kick off right now and see what we have time for.
Yeah, so those are all great. May I begin, Steve?
Yes, please.
Well, number 1, this actually works almost best for virtual groups, and we created it in part so that we could use it, and we're a virtual group. We're spread all over the world. So this can be taken without anyone meeting. That said, it is important to meet. So we're actually going to be gaining experience for different kinds of groups. But the most important thing to say is that, yes, this definitely works for virtual groups. The groups don't have to meet physically at any point during the process. It also shows signs of working for a cross-cultural in very different cultures. And if we had more time, we'd tell you a wonderful story about how it was used in Sierra Leone during the Ebola epidemic. Not the computer platform, but the method. And business groups, by all means, I think in some ways it'll work more easily for business groups than for other kind of groups because it can be assigned, because you can meet physically. The participation basically can be mandated in a business group more than in a volunteer group. We have our experience with the B Corps, and also the idea that the best to begin incrementally. Don't start system-wide. Start with a committee or some subgroup, and if it works for them, it'll spread itself. Also, this is closely related to a method called rapid results, which is we could talk more about, which kind of emulates this. So now, having said all of that, the actual internet platform is very newly launched. It's just launched within a couple of weeks ago. It's in its beta version. And so although we have a lot of experience in some respects, we're only beginning to accumulate experience with the actual internet platform. And so we'll be learning a lot. And we invite groups to get started, especially groups that don't mind, a few wrinkles here and there, and to help us actually, begin to use this, get in at the ground floor.
if I can add just a few things, we're trying to put together principles that have been derived from basic science, have been scaled up, and we're bringing together these concepts of psychological flexibility and Ostrom's design principles. Take the cross-cultural part of it. The Ostrom principles were derived from group functioning across the world, water systems in Nepal, etc. And we've looked also at the psychological flexibility part. We've recently published a piece with 16 different nations and literally all parts of the world to see does psychological flexibility function the same way, and the answer is yes. So by one of the advantages of focusing on these evolutionary principles is that we can start in a way that allows individuals but also groups and communities and cultures with their particular values, with their particular goals to come in, and because we're dealing at such a high level of abstraction, when you apply them, it's not the same kind of problem that we're used to with the failure to move across cultures. And so if you want to see this, if you go to the Huffington Post and put in my name, you'll see a blog on the application of the Ostrom principles to the Ebola crisis, as mentioned by David, and a very sweet story there about how we were able to more humanize the effort to control Ebola and not simply do it with doctors and guns, which is basically how it was done. The behavioral scientists and psychotherapists have a role, and leaving behind a more intact culture when we're requiring people to do things that are very difficult. For example, burning the bodies of the dead without washing and their rituals. And in terms of organizations, we're seeing the same thing on these principles we brought together. We've done randomized controlled trials of efforts targeted at psychological flexibility in organizations, like Goldman Sachs or I'm blocking on the name, a large internet firm in San Francisco. It'll occur, Salesforce.com, and Frank Bond is a member of our development team, and he is the director of the School of Management at the University of London. So we have major people who are involved in doing organizational consulting, leadership training, and so forth. And you will see when you dive in that some of these things resonate with what you already know about leadership development. And so we're not coming here saying this is all brand new. What's different about it is by having the higher level principles, we can empower what we already know so that we can focus on the 20% that does the 80% of work and not spend time on things that are less central, because there's a weeding out of less central things that sort of simplifying our tasks as coaches that come from knowing what the principles are that produce changes in organizations.
And I guess just to finish up on leadership, you can see from the whole process that this is promoting a form of leadership which is egalitarian, where the leader plays a moderating role. The idea of the strong leader that decisively makes unilateral decisions is something that we think doesn't work very well. We'll have the data to show it, I think. And so this is almost inherently seems to lead in the direction of a certain leadership style, which is egalitarian.
And it reflects on things like emotional intelligence and so forth, things that we know well already. So you're not going to suddenly be a stranger in a strange land. If you explore PROSOCIAL, you'll see resonance with the things you're already doing, but hopefully it'll simplify and empower the work that you do.
Great. So I just want, you just echoed exactly what I was thinking, Stephen, which is I think for those of us who work in organizations and our coaching teams or facilitating groups, these are principles that to a certain extent are already sort of endemic to our work. And what I love about what you're doing, and hopefully those of you on this webinar and we'll spread the word to have this resource, because I think ultimately what we're able to do is bring another level of credibility and evidence-based research that actually underpins what we're trying to accomplish in organizations, and will obviously further our work and lead to us being even more likely to be successful. So
absolutely, it'll lead to the formation of a research community that's using a common methodology.
which is super, and you guys are already ahead of the curve with that. So I'm sensitive to the fact that we're past our 2:15 time, and I know that we've taken up a lot of your time as speakers, and I want to thank you both for taking the time to share your work with us. I think it's been incredibly enlightening, and I hope that those of you that didn't get your question asked will forward your question to me or follow up directly with them. With either of our speakers. And as Stephanie indicated at the beginning of the webinar, this will be recorded and within a couple of days will be available for you to review sort of at your leisure, and we'll hopefully see you again. So thank you both. Very, very much appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
Goodbye.
I'm hearing the sound of one hand clapping.
Yes. Actually, lots of two hands, but they don't find their way through cyberspace.